Well, thank you very much, Mr. Rowan. It's a great pleasure to serve under your chairmanship today, and indeed to echo the sentiments that have already been expressed, both in interventions and in speeches, and in the excellent speech of my honourable friend, the member for Sheffield Central. And if I might say so, I think the questions that he posed, the Minister is in his place, the questions he posed, of course, don't just sit in the Department for Education, they sit across government, and the need for, if we're really going to be serious about this, the need to break out of those silos and perhaps to have a cross-departmental take on all of this, I think, is really important. So, Mr. Owen, I want to speak principally today about the excellent and enormously positive work that is done in Blackpool. Not just by our Carers Centre, which is long-standing, which I've had the privilege to work with over my 22 years as a local Member of Parliament, but particularly with the young carers from that centre. Because over the last 12 months, they have supported 666, the Carers Centre, young carers. And let us bear in mind, Mr. Owen, that this is, I won't say it's the tip of the iceberg, but it is certainly not the main number of young people caring for a family member or a parent in Blackpool. Various surveys over the years have suggested that the figures are anything between 2,000 and 3,000, and that gives you some sense of it. The other thing, of course, about Blackpool, and it's not just an issue for Blackpool, it's an issue for many inner city areas, but also for seaside and other seaside and coastal communities, is that the degree of transience that there is, double transience of families coming into the town and transience of people moving within the town, often because of family breakups or economic hardships, actually means that the ability for people who need to be cared for to be able to latch onto a local community is much more reduced than it might be in other parts of the country. And that puts even more pressure on the work that those young carers do. Nevertheless, as I say, the good news from Blackpool is that there has been tremendous progress in the last few years, and I have been privileged and very proud to be part of that. And in 2016, we all got a little bit of BBC sort of showbiz sprinkled on us, because the BBC DIY SOS project, which some of you may be familiar with, descended upon Blackpool to transform a building, Blenheim House, which is actually in the constituency of my parliamentary neighbour, the member for Blackpool North and Cleveland, but which serves the whole of Blackpool, and to transform that into a young carers centre. And literally hundreds and hundreds of volunteers came from across the community, and I along with some of my councillors, lent my hod, as it were, clearing rubble and general labouring tasks in the morning. And that I want to also pay tribute to Beaver Brooks, the local business that provided that for them and have supported them very, very strongly ever since. And I also, it's invidious when one thinks about the work that's done by young carers and the carers associations that support them, to single out lots of individuals. But I do particularly want to single out Michelle Smith, who has done extraordinary things with that centre and everything that's been taken forward from it. Very briefly.
Paying fitting tribute to the organisations in his constituency. Will you join me in recognising the work of volunteers, particularly volunteers who assist in my constituency, Gloucestershire Young Carers, because it is their contribution which means that it can reach so much further and change so many more lives.
I'm delighted to agree with the honourable gentleman. Of course, the multiplier factor is very important, but it's also very important, of course, that young carers themselves don't get burnt out. And that, I think, is one of the key issues. And not as it was young carers, but I have a family history of my father who cared for my mother for nearly 25 years, who had severe osteoporosis. And unfortunately, he wouldn't take advantage of other things. And I just saw in his latter years how he was absolutely worn down by that process. But of course, young people may not show that, but they have the same sorts of issues. And when I tell you that 48% of those young people in Blackpool are caring for a parent due to substance misuse, or mental ill health, you will get some sense as to the sorts of issues that they have to face and deal with. In the autumn of last year, of course, there was a very important set of new research from Nottingham University which revealed that the number of young people between the ages of 11 to 16 who act as carers has more than doubled since a comparable BBC survey in 2010. And I was privileged to discuss those findings with people from the Carers Centre, but also with two young carers, Caitlin Churchill and Claire Taylor, who'd written to me over the summer with their personal experience, as well as giving ideas to give more support in the classroom. And I think the classroom is a key factor in this area. We've heard today about the need for Ofsted to be more forthcoming in that area, but it's also an issue that school heads and school teachers need to take on board, and that they may not even know that they have young carers in their midst, but those young carers who sometimes perhaps turn up looking bleary-eyed, sometimes haven't had a meal, sometimes these children, these young people, are sort of disciplined for this because they don't regard it as care as a caring thing. It's just something I'm doing for mum or dad, or sometimes for an older sister or whatever. So I think that's very important, as is the mental health project that was launched by Blackpool Carers Centre for Young Carers last spring. There have been workshops on this, and I think, and in my experience, sometimes when you bring young people together outside of their school frameworks and put 6 young people from one school or one college with another, they work more collaboratively and they don't feel as constrained. But we need to make sure that the voluntary efforts and the voluntary research that are done by those young people outside of school also then feeds into schools and colleges as well. I think also the role of the local authority is important, and Blackpool is a small unitary authority, and I'm sad to say that we've been hit quite strongly very strongly in fact, by cuts over the last 6 to 7 years, but they do support the Carers Centre. Yeah, they do support the Carers Centre with a relatively modest amount of funding. So there we have it, a good example of people taking things forward. But if I could just say one last thing to the Minister, that the role of young carers ought to be recognised, not just by Ofsted, but by what we think about in terms of bursaries, and particularly about them when they want to come and go into higher education under apprenticeships.
Thank you very much indeed, Mr. Owen. It's a pleasure.